Welcome to Professor Ortlieb's Bluebook podcast, a series of podcasts designed to teach 1L students the basics of legal citation using the Bluebook. In this, our final installation, we're going to take a look at Bluebook Rule 18, which covers citation to internet resources. In general, the Bluebook still wants you to rely on print sources for your citations. Therefore, you want to cite to an electronic source only when the information is not available in traditional print sources, or a copy of the source cannot be located because it's so obscure that it's practically unavailable. The Bluebook actually prefers you to provide a parallel cite to an electronic source rather than to only rely on an electronic source. So you may include parallel cites to electronic sources where it would be helpful to your reader, make it easier for your reader to access that information. One of the most popular internet resources that you will cite to are law databases for cases or statutes. When I'm speaking of law databases, I'm talking about places like Westlaw, Lexis, or Bloomberg. Cites to law databases for cases include the following information. They include the case name, formatted according to Rule 10.2 using all the same abbreviations and conventions that you would use if you were citing to the case as it was printed in a reporter. You'll also include the docket number, which can be found in the caption of the case, a database identifier and number, which is unique to each database provider, a pin cite, though now we won't be citing to pages, but instead we'll be citing to screen numbers preceded by an asterisk, or paragraph numbers preceded by the paragraph symbol. You're going to provide a parenthetical that's going to include the court name, just as we did for our print sources. And finally, we'll include the full date of the most recent disposition, not simply the year of decision, as we did for a printed case. Here's an example from the made-up case of Horton versus Here's a Who. My case name is formatted and abbreviated the exact same way I would if I were citing to this case as printed in a reporter. After my comma setting off my case name, I'm going to put in my docket number, which will vary according to jurisdiction, but is always available within the caption of a case, no matter which database you look at. I then put in my unique database identifier. You'll see here, Lexis designates which level of court and the year to make it easier for you to understand. Westlaw is a little bit different. It's going to give you the year of the decision, followed by capital W, capital L, and then a unique number just for that case. I'm going to set off my database identifier and number just as I would my reporter and volume number information with a comma, and then I'm going to include my pin cite. Unlike the printed reporter cites that don't include the word @ for my pin cite, when I'm citing to an internet source, I will provide @ before my pin cite. Here I'm indicating that the pin cite is according to the screen number as given by Lexis, not by paragraph number, therefore it's an asterisk before it, and I follow that up with my closing parenthetical, with my court of decision, here the 7th Circuit, and the specific date, the full date of decision. Please remember that months do have abbreviations in the Bluebook. You can find it in the tables at the end. You might also want to cite to a database when citing a statute. You're going to cite the majority of the statute or the majority of your cite formatted according to Rule 12. But your parenthetical is going to become a little bit different. The parenthetical should contain the following information: the name of the database, the currency of the database as provided by the database itself, and finally, the publisher, editor, or compiler, unless this is the official code. Here's a small challenge for you. This is a piece of statute from the Pennsylvania Consolidated Statutes Annotated by LexisNexis. I want you to format the full citation for this code, keeping in mind that this is Title 75, Section 3802. See if you can put in the proper parenthetical and cite this according to Rule 12, 18, and T1. Pause this podcast until you've formatted your answer, then continue. Here's your answer. 75. PA, cons, stat, and. Now, I bet a bunch of you probably put in PACS because that's what you saw on the top of the Lexis print. But that's not the appropriate abbreviation for a Bluebook formatted site. That might be fine in a Pennsylvania Court of Appeals. And of course, we always consult the regular rules when citing sources to a court. But this, we wanted to focus on what the Bluebook says. And if we go to T1, we can see that the Pennsylvania Consolidated Statutes are abbreviated PA, period, space, CONS, period, space, stat, period, space, and period, space. Do include a space before and after your section symbol, and then 3802 comes in. The next tricky part of this site is your parenthetical. So the appropriate way to format this parenthetical would be to put Lexis as your database and its currency through the 2014 Regular Session Act 26, which you can see was printed at the top of the page below 75 PACS 3802. Note that you don't have to repeat the compiler again because Lexis is already in there. Another time you might find it helpful to provide an internet site would be to provide a parallel site to the internet resource. How do you do this? Well, you form the site to the printed source according to the Bluebook rules for that type of source. If it's a book, follow the rules for a book. If it's a periodical, follow those rules. If it's a case, follow Rule 10. Once you've formatted that citation, you simply add a comma and the web address. Here's an example from our Horton versus Here's a Who made-up case from earlier, and let's just imagine that it was published in the Federal Reporter 3rd Series. You notice I have my case name formatted just as I would for a print resource, my volume, reporter name, and page number, followed by my court date parenthetical. I didn't put a pin site in here, but it would probably be a good idea to include it. It would come after my 4675 and set off by a comma. To add my parallel site, I simply added the comma after I closed my parenthetical and I put in the web address. Nothing fancy, nothing special, and simply added a period at the end of my web address. Note that I turned off any auto formatting that would automatically hyperlink to that document in my site. So make sure that you do make that correction to any auto correcting that Microsoft Word might do to your sites as you're putting them together for your memos, briefs, or homework. As we've become more addicted to social media and more information gets put out on the internet, we clearly won't be just citing to cases and statutes that we find on Lexis and Westlaw. It will be necessary from time to time to provide citation to other internet resources. Those of you who are interested in business law will find that more and more companies are only providing prospectus and disclosures via their websites and via electronic sources. So remember, the Bluebook wants you to cite to print if it's available. So if it's possible to cite to the source in print, do so. But if it's not, then you can use Rule 18.1 to help you craft your internet source site. In general, a basic site to an internet resource is going to include information like the author, the title, the date and time of posting, of course the URL where that information can be found, any sort of pinpoint citation that you might be able to provide. But as you can imagine, the range and variety of internet sources out there are just too broad to cover in this short podcast. So I'd really like to call your attention to Rules 18.1 and 18.2.1. At 18.1, you'll see an excerpt of examples of how to cite different types of authorities and different types of sources from the internet. 18.2.1 gets into more depth with more examples of how to format author, title, date and time, URL, and pinpoint citation for specific types of sources. So once you know what kind of internet source you want to cite, be a Facebook post, a Twitter post, a blog, or a prospectus, you're going to want to go into 18.2.1 to craft it. Here's an exemplar, 2 excerpts from the quick references you can find for basic citation forms in Rule 18.1. You'll see over here, social media posts. They give you an example of Twitter. But if you go into 18.2.1, you'll also see examples of how to cite to a Facebook post. Note also that 18.1 includes helpful information on how to format online-only sources, as you can see here. Now, contrasting the two, you can see in the social media post, date and time got down to the specific exact time that the tweet was sent, but looking at online-only sources, you might just put in the date that you last visited that site. You'll see that there's also differences between dynamic sources and static sources. So you're going to need to know a lot more about the source that you're trying to cite before you can start to craft it. 18.1 and 18.2 are going to be your best friends in that respect. You've now completed this final podcast of the Bluebook 1L series. If you have any questions, please be sure to see your professor or your teaching assistant. Good luck.